Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Hello and welcome to Utopian Horizons, a podcast where I cover a different utopia, dystopia, utopian thinker or movement in each episode. It's good to be back after a short break, fresh in 2019. Sorry about the lack of episodes towards the end of the year. I had intended to get one or two out in December and another bonus episode as well, but moving house, not having the internet for a bit, family coming to visit, there just wasn't time. But anyway, now I'm back and I'm hoping to have a few episodes coming soon, so it should be good. This episode is about Clans of the Alphane Moon. It's a Philip K. Dick novel, so this is me returning to my mini-series, if you like, trying to work my way through every Philip K. Dick novel. For people new to the podcast, I'm doing these solo as opposed to the normal interview format, so it's just going to be me here talking through this book. So I've talked before about themes or motifs that repeat throughout Philip K. Dick's career. Some of these things are here, but I think this repetition or remixing of ideas can also happen in phases where things kind of cycle in or out or kind of reappear for a while. Even names. So there's a character here called Baines, you might remember from the episode I did on Man in the High Castle. Also had a character called Baines. Both have some kind of Nazi association. If it's very tenuous, not particularly strong in this novel, but still. But the recent books I did, Martian Time Slip, The Simulacra, both discussed mental health and anti-psychiatry, and those things are here very strongly in this novel. Simulacra, obviously, in this Simulacra. The android, if you prefer, that's here again. So this is something of a thematic trilogy we're dealing with here in Martian Time Slip, Simulacra, and this novel. So the next one we move on to, which will be either The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch or Dr. Blood Money, will be moving on to kind of new territory. Those kind of themes that he's dealing with here kind of cycle out, and he moves on to some new stuff. So this will be the last of that kind of thematic trilogy, I guess. So this book was published in 1964. It was also written that year. I would say in that year, Philip K. Dick also wrote The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, The Zap Gun, The Penultimate Truth, Dies Irae, although that was written with Roger Zelazny, and The Unteleported Man, although I don't think that was finished. I think that was unfinished. I think it was later finished by somebody else and published as Lies Inc. after his death. The year before, he wrote Dr. Blood Money, or How We Get Along After the Bomb, The Game Players of Titan, The Simulacra, and The Crack in Space. So I've mentioned his insane productivity before, and that gives you a very kind of clear picture of just how ridiculously quickly he was producing books, and that accounts for this remix of ideas and the occasional messiness that I've talked about before, which I think is a part of Philip K. Dick's novels' quality. There are examples in this. Joan, I don't know how you're supposed to say her name, Joan Trieste, something like that, who appears in this book. She is someone with psi abilities. So her ability is that she can... The implication is that there's people with different abilities and they emerge. You never know exactly what their abilities will be. Her ability is that she can make time flow backwards in a limited area. She says roughly 12 by 9, up to a period of 5 minutes. Again, this idea of going backwards or playing with time reappears in Ubik and Counterclock World. But anyway, this feels like it will be important when it first appears, or certainly that the character will be important, her power perhaps, but it's not. So she's a character that kind of cycles out quite quickly. that happens a lot in this book. He kind of cycles in characters which seem to be important and then just moves on from them. But what she does with her power is she's rushed to bad traffic accidents and to try and save people, or at least bring them back to a state where they can be treated before they died. And she's on really bad pay and her conditions are really bad. She's on call 24 hours a day. And I very much like that way that something extraordinary, like these incredible powers are incorporated into the mundanity of capital. I think it's a very Dickian move. And I think that's a good example of what I talk about with the messiness, sometimes lending something to the books without this thing that feels like it's going to be very special and is incredible that this person can do that, which in another book or in another piece of media that wouldn't, that would have to be like the thing, like the superhero novel. These powers are what make these people, what makes the stories. But here it's just kind of like an incidental thing that disappears and, as I say, becomes something very boring because capital just kind of incorporates it into its own system and makes it into something very tedious and boring and unimportant. So the kind of incidental nature of it in that book is a good way of representing that. So that's a good example of how his messiness, intentionally or not, can have an effect, I think. So anyway, the reason I brought up this period of insane productivity and gave you those examples of how many books he was writing is I think it's interesting and not insignificant that a guy who's very interested, as I think Frederick Jameson said, in technologies of production and reproduction, is producing these books at an insane rate. Like kind of reeling them off a production line, and almost like reproducing not the same novels, but as I said, this recycling ideas. He's reproducing themes like all the time. And if you can read his writings as being about the horrors of late capitalism in some way, and I think this way of producing them gives them something. Like they have this sense of breaking apart. Like they've been produced so quickly, and so he's so on the edge and churning them out that they're barely holding together. And I think that lends them something that, he wanted to think of himself as an artist and he wanted to deal with philosophical implications, but he was in poverty for most of his life, so he's been kind of forced to churn out these commodities at this insane rate. So I think in some way the kind of method of their production, or the way in which they're produced, reflects back on the system in which they're being produced, in the way that the capitalism was kind of commodifies what he's trying to do. If you see what I mean, I hope that makes sense. So that this kind of quality of breaking apart, or things breaking through that they have because of the way the speed at which he's being forced to produce them, in some way reflects back on the process or the system in which they're being made. I think there's something interesting about that. I found that quite hard to articulate what I mean there, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to get at. Anyway, on to the story of this book. So the Alphane Moon that the title refers to is a moon in space, and it's the site of a former mental hospital. It is an Alphane Moon because it was, I believe, previously owned by the Alphanes, who are an alien race of kind of like insects, like sentient and intelligent. But anyway, the humans, or Terrans, I think they're referred to, were at war with them, and they took this moon during the war, made it to a mental hospital. I think it's basically for people who couldn't deal with like the pressures of colonization, like space colonization, and ended up there. And anyway, the war's now over. But because the moon, there was like a kind of revolution on the moon, and the mental patients took over. Basically, the Earth lost contact with the moon, and also because the terms of the war being over, the treaty or whatever, the Alphanes have to leave it. So it's kind of been left on its own for the people who the mental patients who took over there and organised a new society. And Earth wants it back, basically. And the idea is to send a psychologist to the moon to see what's going on there, evaluate the patients there in the guise of a kind of humanitarian project. That's how they kind of frame it to her, but it's pretty clear, and I think even to her, really, that they have other motives. They basically want, I think, her to declare that they need treatment to justify Earth coming in and taking it back or whatever. But anyway, so the clans that it refers to, the clans of the Alphane Moon. So these are groups of people who are divided into different settlements along the lines of their mental health problems, and each one kind of performs a social function. I would just say before I describe these are the way that Philip K. Dick, or even the terms that are used here and the way that Philip K. Dick represents these mental health problems are certainly out of date, and they're definitely badly represented. But the terms I'm using here, I'm just using the terms of the novel to explain to you how they're represented in the book. So there's the clans. There is a council, which is kind of the ruling body of the moon, and there's a representative from each clan at the council. So we have the pairs, which is short for paranoids, and they're represented by Gabrielle Baines, and they live in the settlement of Adolfville. All the settlements tend to refer to Adolf, so obviously meant to refer to Hitler, the idea being he's kind of, for Philip K. Dick, a kind of embodiment of paranoia, and each one has a famous person in the name of their settlement who represents that mental health problem. They're kind of the statesman class. They're kind of constant planning and worrying about the machinations of other factions and so on, makes them into a kind of statesman class. There's the Manses, who are basically meant to be manics. Howard Straw is their representative. They are meant to be very creative and very active. They've invented a lot of weapons because of their kind of insane creativity, but they're also very disordered and very aggressive and violent, which makes them very unliked by all the other clans, because they're kind of bully basically all the other people, and they're very aggressive towards them. There is the Schizes, which is obviously meant to refer to schizophrenia. Their representative is Omar Diamond, and they're kind of a mystic class. They're always having visions, and in this novel, these different realities they live in, these visions are, we should say, represented as being they're not so much they have a hallucinatory aspect, but these realities are valid within the terms of the book, which is a classic Philip K. Dick thing of reality being not that solid and kind of open to moving into different states. So these visions have a clear value in this world. There are Hebes, which I've looked up and found is short for hebephrenia, which is apparently an old term for a form of schizophrenia that's no longer recognised. They live in Gandhi Town, and they are kind of lazy, or at least disengaged. There's just rubbish and junk everywhere. They are kind of a manual labour class when they will do it, and when they're not just kind of sitting around. They also have some visionaries. They're represented by Jacob Simon. There's another very important one called Ignaz Ledobar, who is a kind of referred to as a saint, who, again, kind of has visions and so on. There are the Polys, which is apparently short for polymorphic schizophrenia. They are very creative and they produce new ideas. It says that all children on the moon are born polys, and that they go to a common central school until it's kind of clear which clan they should go into. So there's a suggestion in the book that these people have been diagnosed, kind of categorized as poly, many of them may not actually be mentally ill at the outset, but that's just kind of because the society is organized in that way. People have to be categorized, so that's how they've kind of all been default default categorized. There's the obcoms, who are obviously obsessive compulsive, who barely feature in the story. They are the bureaucrat class because of, pretty obvious why he's made that connection. This idea that bureaucrats are kind of obsessed with detail and organization, so that's what they do. There's the depths, who are obviously people who suffer with depression, who are perhaps the most offensively portrayed class in this book. They are kind of a source of a lot of disdain from all the other clans. They kind of find them very annoying. They're defined by kind of paralysis of mustering any will to do anything, which I suppose in some ways representative of kind of problems that people who suffer depression have to deal with, but it's not represented. It's represented in a very unempathetic way, I would say, most of the time. Yeah, as I say, there's just kind of a lot of disdain for them. So the other part of this is the protagonist, Chuck Rittersdorf, who is having marital problems. He is going to be getting divorced from his wife, Mary, who is a psychologist who's working at a marriage counsellor at the beginning of the book. But she wants to be the psychologist that's going to this planet, that the government is looking for, to send to the Alphane Moon. And she basically wants, I think it's like a kind of voluntary position, or she'll be taking a pay cut at least, whatever. So she wants Chuck to, whose job is to create dialogue for CIA simulacra or robots. He wants him to take a better paying job, and she's basically going to force him to do so. But anyway, he gets the chance to control the simulacra that is going to be going with Mary to the Alphane Moon, and he decides to plot to use it to kill her. So the first thing I want to focus in on with this book, I've talked a lot about, or at least I've mentioned pretty much every episode I've done on the Philip K. Dick novel, I think, misogyny in his books. I said it was something that I would focus in on at some point, and I think now is the time to do that with what I consider to be, as memory serves, and of the ones I've read, his most blatantly misogynistic novel. So I remember reading this the first time and thinking, like, who's the woman you hate so much here? There is, I think I probably had some awareness of the fact that he had multiple marriages, but it just comes out so strongly here that he's getting at someone that kind of, you can't help but noticing it in a way that's very distracting. So as I mentioned, she is trying to get him to take a job that would get more money and status. She's arranged a meeting for him to get a job writing for a comedy show for this big star called Bunny Hentman, and it says basically so that she can take pride in his work, and this is where a lot of the arguments come from. She's kind of angered at his lack of ambition, his kind of inertia when he stayed in his job. There's constant repetitions of her superiority, his clear feeling of inferiority. She kind of diagnoses him, not to later in the book when she's on the Alphane Moon, she says that he has a streak of hebephrenia in him, which I mentioned later. So as far as she's concerned, she's got this latent streak of mental illness. And yeah, she's pushing forward with this divorce. She's trying to use it to force him to take another job, which then, and to get the money from him to kind of fund what she wants to do. So she's already in their marriage portrayed as kind of very aggressively trying to force him to do something for money and status that to kind of meet her standards. And in this divorce, she's then forcing, using the divorce to take control of her life and get what she wants for her own life. There's this thing where they talk about how she's sold a house or is selling the house and putting their daughter in boarding school. These children don't appear in the novel at all, but she's 6 years old, and he says, Chuck that is, says she's too young to be sent away from home. And I've mentioned before this trope of cold women, and that's what we see here. That's what he's clearly trying to represent with this woman, obviously traditionally meant to be thought of as a maternal figure, sending away this poor child. It's her fault as far as he's concerned. And yeah, this is how a lot of women are represented in his books. This very icy, cold trope. She's very bitchy. She's very brutal. She comes to this shitty apartment that he's now living in, like terrible, in like a really rough area, in a really bad apartment building, like falling apart. She rolls up in a fancy car and forces him to write a check for her for I can't remember for what, but and he's clearly like emasculated. He shrinks before her. You can already see what I'm talking about with he's portraying this woman, her coldness, her bitchiness, her controlling nature in such an aggressive way that it really shines through as really kind of sticks out as something strange, and you clearly think he's writing to get at someone here. We also have there's this weird scene with a receptionist. Some talk about how like bras are out of fashion or whatever, so you can see people's nipples, and when she comes in, the receptionist, who's I believe has got like big tits, which in Philip K. Dick's mind is some kind of sign of virtue. I think if you've read in his books before, he often focuses on women's breasts, like when he weighing up their physical appearance, but always really commonly focuses on breasts. And Mary's, of course, are a lot smaller, and they do get evaluated favourably by another character later in the book. But anyway, for Chuck, they're smaller. This other woman has bigger breasts, and you can see her nipples. So in Philip K. Dick's mind, obviously a much better person, but her nipples retract when Mary comes in, and I think it's when you said she meets her coldness. So again, literally this idea of the cold woman, she's literally come into a room with her coldness and made the nipples of the nice big breasts of the other woman retract, which is in Philip K. Dick mind is kind of clear indication of how evil she is. I think that scene kind of very represents the very kind of strange approach he has to women and how he views them. So Mary literally says to him, "You'll never be free of me. I'll always cost you something. It will cost you more than you can afford to pay." She's actively punishing him. She's taking pleasure in his suffering, and she's determined to make it worse, to punish him. Other people see this in her in some way. Bunny Hedman, who I mentioned, this big comedy star, he says that he talks about how cold Chuck's wife is. Ignaz Lederbar, who I mentioned, this saint or visionary, there's a scene where he has a kind of vision of a monster coming to the planet, and this kind of huge threat, it's literally this big, like, vicious, aggressive, violent monster. And I think it's very clear that this is meant to be, again, Mary. This is who it's meant to represent. What we find out later as the book progresses is it's suggested that she's repressed and she has some illness. So there's a scene where where Baines actually, because of once she's got to the Alphane Moon and the Alphanes see these, correctly identify this psychological mission as a threat. They're worried about the power that Earth has and think that they're basically going to take over. So they try and come up with a plan to deal with that. And the idea that Baines decides on for some reason is that he's going to seduce her, and the council agrees to this. He gets an aphrodisiac, which he basically uses to date rape her, which has its own problems and opens up a whole other can of worms, which I'll leave for now. But she ends up in the scene kind of violently biting him, almost like eating him in a way that makes him regret his decision. He's trying to like get to an emergency burn, and she's like holding him down, grabbing his ankle and pulling him back, trying to having sex with him while she's like biting, like he's bleeding everywhere. So there's this repressed, like primal libidinal energy that she has. It kind of they determine in the book, so it wasn't just this aphrodisiac that did this to her. The aphrodisiac unleashed something in her. He's left, like, he passes out And he wakes up after she's had sex and like dumped him out in the desert covered in blood and everything. So you can see again this very clear idea of this cold, horrible woman who is kind of punishing Chuck, and she's like repressing like her sexual nature. It's like there's something it's kind of ill in her. She's that repression of the sexual energy, which you see in that scene with the breasts, like her coldness kind of cutting down the sexual aura of the receptionist. There's this idea that there's something evil in her there, like her not being sexual, not being again not being maternal, not being sexual, not being these things that Philip K. Dick, I think, wants a woman to be. And yeah, this idea that she's ill and repressed. They think because of her aggression and so forth that she's going to be a man's. And the whole idea was that she thought she diagnosed Chuck as sick, and she's a psychologist and all this. Chuck tries to commit suicide near the beginning of the book, so he's the guy who's meant to be mentally ill in some way, and they come to this kind of conclusion that actually it's maybe she's mentally ill. They kind of come to this agreement where they persuade her to take this test, and it turns out that Chuck has to take it as well. It turns out that Chuck is completely fine, and she is mentally ill. And not only is she not a man's, she is a dep or a depressive, which again problematic. But in the terms of the book, I think that's very much portrayed as being like the worst thing you could be. And this continual pressing of the issue of his income, that's due to her depression, the sense that something had to be done or we were doomed, and that's why she was acting like that towards Chuck. So like his suicidal thing, his problems, they're all down to her. So there's this whole thing of you treated me as mentally ill, and then this is what kind of comes across again, this thing of this is something that's taking place outside of the novel, as well as in the novel. This idea, you having these arguments of you want me to do this, you want me to do that, and really it's all your mental health problem and you're mentally ill. And look, Chuck's been found out that he's completely fine, and she is really the ill one. It's kind of very this moment of getting back to her. Not only that, she's a dep, which, as I say, within the book is depicted really negatively. So she's kind of like the worst of the mental health problems that they have there. She's the worst one you can be, and she's kind of devastated by that diagnosis as well. So it's kind of a kind of punishment. And at the end, you have the couple. After that, even though they say Chuck planned to kill her, and they both tried to kill each other at some point, but there's a lot of plot in Philip K. Dick novels, so I can't go into all of this. So anyway, the couple end up somewhat reunified. There's a possibility now of working things out and having a new relationship. They decide to stay on the Alphane Moon, and we end up with Mary. Previously, this very powerful, again, as I say, depicted negatively, but nonetheless a very powerful, forceful woman. She's standing next to him with her head kind of tilted, resting on Chuck's shoulder, and she says, "Tell me it will be okay." Kind of desperately needing his validation and tamed. And this is the whole trajectory of this novel, apart from the many detours. This vicious portrayal of this woman. There's a vindictiveness to the way she's portrayed that overshadows the whole story. As I say, the whole thing is about you thought of me as the one that had problems. You criticised me for, thinking about, as I've mentioned before, Philip K. Dick lived in poverty. Chuck is somebody who's not earning very much money. There's no coincidence in that, I don't think. This whole, I've mentioned this as well, Dick's uneasiness about his status as a science fiction writer. I mentioned earlier in this episode, him thinking of himself as an artist, as someone with something of value to say philosophically, working this medium, not respected, not much money. So, all these issues that he has, and these insecurities about the status of the woman who's more successful than him. The whole thing is about how all these problems can then be transported onto her. Actually, you were the one that was mentally ill. I was fine the whole time. You pushed everything onto me. You are the sick one. And that's very clearly, as I say, it's very clearly not just a story. You don't need this context to know this. You read the story and you can see that he's very clearly, this is a very spiteful portrayal of this character, and it's very clearly an aggression towards a particular woman in his life. And I think you can read it more generally as a kind of aggression towards women. There's a nice quote which I've taken from a book by Christopher Palmer called Philip K. Dick, Exhilaration and Terror of the Postmodern. And he says, talking about this book, a novel about derangement becomes a deranged novel. Mary's aggression towards Chuck is capped by the author's aggression towards Mary. So yeah, I think that quite nicely sums up what's happening in this book in terms of Mary and the misogyny there. I wanted to talk about some biographical details here as well. I'm usually very resistant to reading kind of biographical readings of Dick, because it tends to happen a lot when people are talking about Dick. They keep referring, and his life is very interesting and lots of strange stories and weird things that happened in his life, which makes it tempting to do that. But I find that when that's done, it can become very messy, and there's the reading of his novels always becomes biography. And yeah, I don't always think it's particularly productive. I think I'd rather focus on the books themselves most of the time. But anyway, it's so obvious in this book that it's kind of not difficult to do that, and I thought might be worth doing it at this point. So just on this idea of him getting at somebody on his, as I mentioned, he was married a few times, but on the particular marriage that he's writing about here, I'm taking this from Wikipedia. Says he was physically abusive with his third wife, Anne Williams Rubenstein. After one argument in 1963, he attempted to push her off a cliff in a car, then later claimed she was trying to kill him and convinced a psychiatrist to commit her involuntarily. After filing for divorce in 1964, he moved to Oakland to live with a fan, Grania Davis. Shortly after, he attempted suicide by driving off the road while she was a passenger. So, yeah, Philip K. Dick, not always a very nice man. This is from an interview I found in the New York Times, or a quote from an interview in the New York Times with the aforementioned wife, Anne Williams Rubenstein. This is talking about a bit more detail on the thing of him trying to kill her. One day they were driving out of a field after putting lumber in the barn. Dick opened the gate, Mrs. Dick gunned the motor, and he ran off. I guess he thought I was trying to kill him, she said. So yeah, the paranoia that Dick is writing about in the novel, yeah, that was something that he was living with. And yeah, it's clear that this is the woman that he was writing about. In terms of his paranoia, I found a suggestion somewhere as well that in a biography that his paranoia was at least part amphetamine fueled. This is the other reason I mentioned the insane productivity of his novels earlier on. How he was able to do that. Amphetamine abuse, basically. He was taking amphetamines to write constantly. But yeah, this person suggested that he was suffering from amphetamine-induced psychotic disorder, which was kind of enhancing his paranoia. I don't know if that's true. That seems reasonable. What I find interesting about that is Dick's kind of self-awareness. Clearly a very paranoid man, but somebody who understands paranoia very well. One of the characters in this book, I hope it's in this book, talks about paranoia's totalizing nature and how the paranoid is able to weave every new detail into their story. They're able to always make it work, and yeah, he's very good at representing paranoia and how it works. So he has a kind of awareness about his own problems, which is very interesting. In that interview, his wife said when he got her committed, he did actually end up telling the doctors that he should be the one who should be committed. So yeah, he had an awareness of that, and this comes up in a very interesting way in Valis in terms of Philip K. Dick's his kind of ability, his very clear ability to be deluded, but very aware of his delusion at the same time. But that's for when we get to Valis. I'll deal with that in detail when we get there. And on the amphetamine abuse, while I'm mentioning that, in the book, there's a character called Lord Running Clam, a mind-reading alien slime, and he gives Chuck a stimulant that allows him to work 24 hours a day so that he can keep his job at the CIA and take the job writing for Bunny Henman. So, yeah, again, that's clearly a biographical detail. We can also see in this book, I think, that aforementioned anxiety about his status as a science fiction writer. This would have been around the period not long before he wrote this, where he tried writing realist novels instead of science fiction, failed to sell them, gave up for a while, helping his wife with her jewellery business, which you might remember appearing in Man in the High Castle, this homemade jewellery business. That's where that comes from. This is before, and then Man in the High Castle was kind of the breakthrough which returned him to science fiction writing. But he always had this anxiety about how science fiction was perceived as lack of financial success, which is why he tried the realist novels, why he gave it up. And Chuck, in this book, he talks about how the programming that he concocted, the scripts he writes for the simulacra, the androids, is infantile, spurious and biased. He says the main appeal was to school children, both in the USA and the neighbouring communist states, and to the great mass of adults of low educational background. He was, in fact, a hack, and Mary had pointed this out many, many times. I think that is in some way about his science fiction writing, his kind of anxieties about that. There's a couple of other moments like that. Towards the end of the book, Chuck suggests that he's more effective expressing himself through the lines he writes for other characters to speak for the simulacra than he is speaking himself. He basically ends up writing lines for Dan Mageboom, who's the simulacra that goes with Mary to the Alphane Moon to try and convince the clanspeople on the moon in the book's conclusion to ask the Alphanes for protection, to give them the legal authority they need to come into the moon and stop this plot from Earth to take it back over. But anyway, this idea that he's more effective expressing himself through the things he writes, through the things he creates. I think, again, that's how Dick feels about himself. There's also a bit where Bunny Henman, after he takes this job as a writer for Bunny Henman, he has an idea about a CIA agent posing as a marriage counsellor. Chuck twists that to be about a simulacra that is a marriage counsellor. These are obviously Chuck's wife is a marriage counsellor. There's a simulacra going with her. They end up, the story kind of, it becomes very uncomfortable for him because he's got this plot about killing her. They end up kind of working around the story. The people he's working with, in a way that makes him very uncomfortable, end up working the story to be about a plot to try and kill the other person, which Chuck becomes very uncomfortable about. But yeah, so his plot, his story is being created in a piece of fiction within the novel, the story that they're writing for Bunny Henman. That's kind of a meta thing, again, I think, about Dick putting his marital problems into this work. I thought that context might be helpful a bit in this story where there's a vendetta so clearly poking through. And yeah, just to say that I think in these future dystopias that Philip K. Dick writes about, where so much have changed, said this, I think, in the Snatcher episode, but you often have in futures things changing a lot, but gender relations often not so much. And Philip K. Dick's view of the position of women and the position that they should be in is very this is very conservative. This is not changed in the future in any way. It's a very traditional, unhealthy conception of women and the way they behave and their motivations and so on. So, yes, moving on from that. The other big thing in this book, again, we are returned to this theme of mental health and the anti-psychiatry Utopia. I explained the idea of anti-psychiatry before in the episode of Martian Time Slip, so was it the Martian time slip one or the simulacra one? The Martian time slip one, I think. But yeah, I won't go into detail on that again because I've done that, so you can just go back to that episode if you're interested. But yeah, needless to say, basically, just to quickly sum up, anti-psychiatry, an idea which has some merit but also some problems. Basically, the idea of psychiatry being a form of power that's exercised to repress people, and that sometimes, depending on how extreme the proponent might be, the idea that psychiatric problems in a way don't exist, or only problems insofar as they're not allowed by the society. As I say, this has some relevance to it in the way that if you think about how the history of psychiatry and women being diagnosed as hysterics is a very clear example of the kind of thing anti-psychiatry would point to. But yeah, the idea that, and also valuing the idea that society or a system can produce or make mental health problems worse, certainly something I agree with, but the idea that they don't exist, I think problematic. But yeah, so yeah, anyway, this is a anti-psychiatry utopia, this moon. These are people who formed a functional society, and it's a utopia for them because they are now the mental health hospital to them was a torture. This is something they fear. That becomes clear when they see Earth coming in and see the prospect of that returning. It's a sight of horror for them, and they've overthrown it to create a utopian society that allows them to live and function with their problems, or however you want to frame it, in a way that they are happy with and that works for them. And this anti-psychiatry thing is represented from the other side in the mission that Mary's on, being fundamentally an imperialist claim. So they assume that this, again, they've been out of contact with the society. They assume the society is dysfunctional. They don't know because there's been no contact, and they want to treat them, is what they say. It's kind of a paternalistic imperialist claim. A reporter asked them when they're sort of make public the mission that they're going to go on, has it occurred to Plan, that's like the government authority, to just leave this moon alone, to treat its culture as you would any other culture, respecting its values and customs? And clearly they haven't. So when they're discussing this society and they talk about the kind of social functions that each clan solves, one of them says like, oh, okay, so the mains are kind of like the samurai. So there's an acknowledgement from them in some way as well that this society functions, and that like these clans have societal functions in the way that certain groups did have or continue to do on Earth. But yeah, even though this society functions, Mary's kind of job, or the way she wants to frame it, is kind of fundamentally broken and dystopic society. She says it's a different society that is founded on hate, and that people will be gradually cut off from each other. They are cut off from external stimuli, and she kind of says that this will produce hallucination, or kind of almost the production of an alternate reality is the way. When she's talking about hallucination, she's talking about almost the production of a completely separate reality. She says that they will already be hallucinating to some degree. She says they will actually perceive our ship as threatening. Not that they might think that ship was threatening, they will actually perceive it as threatening. She says they will see it as an invading spearhead to overthrow the society. And the other character, the simulacra, who's kind of under his own control at that time, these simulacra can be controlled by a person, but they also function like by themselves when I was there. Anyway, after she says this, they're going to perceive our ship as threatening. They will see it as an invading spearhead to overthrow their society. He says, but that's true. She's kind of like, well, yeah, but they're in a position they hold by accident, and through therapy I will get them to govern themselves, but now they won't be governing themselves because of an accidental thing. They'll kind of be healthy to do it. So yeah, there's this whole, again, the anti-psychiatry thing is very clear there. There's this idea that power is making an imperious claim on them and is using their psychiatric problems or their diagnosis as a way to justify what they want to do. And yeah, this thing of the idea that they perceive them as threatening is evidence for them that what they say is right, even though their ship is threatening, as the simulacra points out. It's true that their ship is threatening. It's true that they're in a spearhead of an invasion. But this categorization allows them to stating that fact, acknowledging that fact, is evidence for them that they are ill and they need their help. So, yeah, in a sense, even they're more perceptive than Mary, who's kind of bought into the fake, or the stated goal of the mission, of what she thinks she's been sent there for. Their paranoia is more real in terms of their perception of what they are there to do than her own perception. And I think this is a vision of Utopia in some way. They talk about the importance of the bonds between the clans. Bain says the bonds were life-giving and to all of them. But there's also something interesting, these relationships that the clans have. They're kind of relationships of both of conflict and of mutual responsibility. They certainly are dysfunctional in many ways. There's a lot of hostility between the clans. There's a lot of distrust and a lot of antagonism in the relationships they have. But nevertheless, they manage to find a way through that. This is also prefigured in some way in Chuck's flat that I mentioned earlier. This very rundown flat in a very dirty living conditions, in a very rundown building, in a very rough community. But that this place is also a place full of outcasts, people who are not part of the system, who are not part of power or the system of power. And there's also a suggestion of a utopian aspect there in these people finding a bond with each other and supporting each other. This kind of, in a way that the power does not have. So obviously, collectivity is always the weapon that people who are not part of the power structure have against power. But so Chuck lives in this awful shitty flat, and he's in his position where he's very down because of his divorce. He stops from committing suicide because of the previously mentioned alien slime who reads his thought that he's about to commit suicide, and sends a woman that previously mentioned, Joan Triste, or whatever, with the psychic powers in to stop him committing suicide. And she says to him, I'll help you decorate. Lord Running Clam will too. Lord Running Clam is the psychic mould. There's a molten metal life form from Jupiter hibernating, but when he comes back to life, he'll want to chip in. He'll want to pitch in, sorry. She says, there's a whiz bird from Mars next door. He has no hands, but he can move objects by psychokinesis. So yeah, there's this little community of outcasts. The novel explains that there's a ghetto situation here from people who are non-Terran. It doesn't matter what their status is on the homeworlds, because they are non-Terran. They are kind of treated as a subclass, so they're forced to inhabit substandard housing like this. So Lord Running Clam, for example, is I think he's very wealthy, and he's wealthy merchant, but because he's non-Terran, he's subject to that prejudice, and he has to live in this shitty housing. So there's this community of outcasts who come together to support each other in a very bad situation, and there's something. So I think Dick's finding value there in a kind of shared suffering, or identifying something in a power of community that is only available to outcasts, which we can read more as I say, if we're talking about power, we can broaden that out and think about outcasts as being, you can think of that in terms of like the 99% or whatever. I think that works. I think he's finding some utopian value there in suggesting that we are able to have a bond that is powerful, that cannot exist for those who are not cast out from power in some way, that's only available to us. And I think there's something valuable there. Again, I would just say, going back to mentioning about the psychic powers being incorporated into Capital, this idea of amazing sci-fi stuff being overwhelmed by like the mundane and kind of exploitation. you've got all these alien creatures with special powers and all amazing different qualities from all different worlds. But then they're living in this, they're just basically living in poor conditions in this shitty flat because like none of that is deemed like inherently valuable because they're in a system of capital. Despite what FL capitalists would tell you, capitalism is of course not neutral to those who kind of work hard for their money or whatever, and these non-Terran people, in this case, are the victims of that. So they are just, the mundane, the idea of exploitation just overwhelms all these kind of amazing sci-fi qualities and becomes something very dull and depressing in some ways. So I think that's useful for thinking about how the kind of effects that a totalizing system like capitalism can have. I focused a lot on the clans on the moon. The other aspect to this is the way that the authorities are contrasted with them. So paranoia, as always, is a big part of this. There's a lot of paranoia going on between the authorities. There's a lot of almost comedic stuff when Chuck is embroiled between the CIA and what's referred to as the Bunny Hentman organization. So this comedian, who we find out is more than a comedian who has connections to the Alphanes going back to before the war. These two groups coming up always with like bizarre theories and trying to manipulate Chuck, and there's this whole thing going on about, they know that we know, but we know that they know we know, and they're coming up with all these different speculations on what they're doing, and it's always the kind of Chuck's position of where he thinks he is and who's supporting him and why, or why they're against him, is always changing and shifting in this immensely complicated plot, which is, I think, again, meant to be a reflection of paranoia and how it functions. In fact, I think it's very clear. So Lord Runningclam, for example, says while Chuck is talking to him about what's going on and these theories and conspiracies, effectively, he says, "Your CIA people's theory strikes me as a miserable bundle of random suspicions, a few separate facts strung together by an intricate structure of ad hoc theorizing, in which everyone is credited with enormous powers for intrigue." Again, this is what the paranoid does. That's how paranoids function. As we mentioned, the paranoid can incorporate any new detail into their story. Everything can become evidence for the thing that they believe, and this is what these organizations are able to do. This is what the novel suggests, and I think is correct in some way, how power functions, how nations functions. I think I mentioned this in the Strider episode, but I can't remember where I saw this, but I remember reading seeing reference to some study where they looked at reports from the Cold War from the CIA and the Soviets, and they saw that both sides massively overestimated the capabilities of the other. I think this happens all the time. Again, so this is a paranoid system of thought. They think that these people have they always think the enemy has their hands in anything. If something happens, they must be doing that. They're controlling them because they want this to happen, and so that everything becomes connected to them and their enemy. And you can see that in how, for example, Russia has become imbued with a great deal of power now. If you listen to certain people, the only reason that Brexit happened is because of Russia. The only reason that Trump won is because of Russia. School shootings are Russia's fault, etc., etc., etc. So yes, the idea here is that authority, power is inherently paranoid, is inherently mentally ill, and that's the contrast that's going on here. These people who are trying to help, in inverted commas, take over the Alphanes, they are just as delusional, if not more so, than them. I think I may have quoted this in the Martian Time Slip episode, but whether I did or not, I'm going to do it again here because it's very relevant. Again, this is from that book, Exhilaration, Terror of the Postmodern, so Christopher Palmer, he's talking about Martian Time Slip and this novel, he says, both suggest that the socially powerful are more dangerous since prevailing ideology both encourages their destructive behaviour and binds them to their own condition than those who are labelled insane and rendered powerless. Both parties live by fantasy. Social reality is not readily available as a norm. So yeah, again, you can read that as an anti-psychiatry thing, but also just in general, I think it works. The idea that power is inherently dangerous. These people who are subjected to categorization or treatment or authority, they're not really a threat because they don't have power. It's power that makes people dangerous. And also these people, power is inherently paranoid. Power is inherently destructive and ill. And yeah, as the quote suggests, because they have power, because they have hegemony, it's able to reinforce itself and reinforce the destructive behaviour. And that's a good way, I think, of you think about, again, the things I mentioned, paranoia of Russia and how that reinforces itself, how everything becomes more evidence that Russia's behind it all. We think about how capitalism is leading us towards environmental catastrophe. It's clearly leading us there. It's clearly a destructive force. We're clearly, in some sense, you can say we're clearly mentally ill for just walking towards that and allowing this to happen. But because this is hegemonic, because it is the prevailing ideology, it's able to keep reinforcing itself and carry on that behaviour. And yeah, I like the way that this moves the view of what dystopia is away from being about, say, in this case, like mental illness or the problems of individuals, I suppose you could say, to being a fundamental problem of inequality, systems and power. That is the dystopia. That I think is effective and an important way of thinking about power and ideology. The final thing I want to talk about is, again, a subject I've mentioned before. Perhaps we can move on to it when we move out of this kind of thematic trilogy, but perhaps not. I don't know. It appears quite often in Dick, I think. Is the subject of empathy, which again is being represented as being very important here, and for Dick is kind of a vital thing. So in this book, I think it's Mary who says this, but she says, the paranoid suffers from the greatest mental disfigurement possible for a human being. He was incapable of empathy. And you may say, obviously, Mary's not a sympathetic character in this, but I think that's meant to be presented. I think Dick agrees with that statement. The being incapable of empathy is the worst thing for a human being. Again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but it's hard not to, where themes keep recycling in Dick for me to not recycle as well. But he's written an essay called The Android and the Human or something like that. He talks about how, for him, the android or the not human is being defined by not having empathy. So this is central for him. This is humanity, empathy. And in this book, we have these rare moments of empathy. And that is perhaps vital for that bond that Baines talked about, suggested in the community, the life-giving bonds of the clans. These random empathetic acts are the thing that holds them together in spite of their kind of dysfunctionality and all the conflict. So it's a moment where a man's this very aggressive clan, one of them saves Baines from death. There's a moment where Baines, this paranoid who ostensibly incapable of empathy, shows some development and is, I think, meant to be becoming human in showing empathy. He saves a love interest of his, whose name I've forgotten. I think we do see hints of him developing or showing empathy for other characters in moments as well. Sorry if this sounds a bit disjointed, but I've got a cough at the moment, so I'm going to be having to be cutting out these coughs for your benefit. So if it sounds a bit weird, a bit disjointed here, that's because I keep coughing and then cutting out. Anyway, in another quote from the same book, Christopher Armour's book. He says, in Clans, Dick finds moments of mutual assistance and kindness in the midst of prevailing aggression and conspiracy, which expresses his sense of the psychopathology of the powerful. So again, these moments of assistance, these moments of empathy, come in opposition to... this isn't something that comes from the powerful. This only comes from people who are under threat from power. So there's aforementioned examples. Lord Running-Clam sacrificing himself to save Chuck. Chuck later managing to resurrect Lord Running-Clam. Joan, whatever her surname is, saving Chuck. In terms of coming towards the end now and just trying to think about what it is that Dick is doing with empathy, I'm going to read quite a long extract now from Palmer's book, but I think it's very useful and very for thinking about empathy and what Dick is doing with it. So we're starting off, he's talking about Philip K. Dick in novels in general at this point, not this specific book, but he says, Dick does retain the strong desire to invent incidents expressing what Susan has called intramundane transcendence. These incidents are expressions of an ethical hope that glimpses a way out of the prison of simulacra. The remainder of this chapter discusses a number of incidents of this kind. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, don't worry, so we won't see those. Showing that they are commonly set outside the system, both narratively and in terms of the society of the given book, and that this gives rise to problems and thence further formal resources in Dick Slater novels. So, skipping forward a bit, he says, first, some further comments on the contents of Dick's imagined worlds. It is commonly maintained that any given invention or gizmo in science fiction should be subjected to sober socio-political extrapolation, explanation, and testing. One cannot simply, fancifully, introduce robot psychiatrists or men with 3 penises into one's novum without thinking through the technical, psychological, and social ramifications. At least send the men with 3 penises along to consult the robot psychiatrists. These considerations may make light of the free play of fantasy and science fiction, as my facetiousness acknowledges, but what is clear is that Philip K. Dick commonly flouts them. His inventions and gizmos are offered frivolously or casually. I mentioned that earlier with the psychic powers and so on. What might be the significance of this? It may be that the process of extrapolation and explanation will itself tie the fiction to a rational cause and effect narrative coherence. Form has ideological implications. This rationalized or rationalizable narrative is not neutral and is associated with a calculating, competitive rationality that is critiqued in Dick's novels and is also seen as lacking grounds, since the grounds of real and unreal, subject and object, are so uncertain in his novels. Narrative coherence is hard to find. An explanation of what has happened is rendered impossible or contradictory. The plot is very often about the search for an explanation, a search which is repeatedly thwarted. Alongside this flux, rather than rising out of it, there tends to occur a certain kind of incident that expresses ethical hope and the value of empathy or solidarity. If we see the whimsically offered future gizmo and the impulsively arising gesture as analogous because both freewheeling and justified and unconnected, then the impulsive arriving gesture can be read as providing Dick with a way out of the problems of narrative which he has set himself by his rejection of sober extrapolation and his departure from linear narrative. So I think there's some other things going on in that section that would require more time and discussion I've got here, but just to say that I think there's something interesting there about how empathy is used, this idea of it kind of emerging outside of the plot, and yes, perhaps a utopian value in that, perhaps a kind of limited perspective, but in totalizing systems like Capital, which I think Dick suggests these systems, or he definitely does suggest that these systems create a reality in some sense. They're more, it's more than they're a system, their whole way of thinking, the way that they make you think, the thing that the place that you're made to live in is a reality that is created by that ideology, by that system. Any resistance to that has to come from outside as a kind of aberration. So, yeah, and if you think about the idea of reforming a system from the inside, I will work for the police, but I will be a good police officer and I will change from the inside, this kind of thing, which more often than not doesn't work. Instead, the change normally has to come from outside. If you think of, the civil rights movement, black people were not granted their rights by nice white people who were reforming the system from the inside. They were won from the outside. And so, this idea of solidarity or empathy as a utopian value that can emerge as an aberration from outside, that can come out of nowhere, as political change can also seem to. I think there's utopian value in that. I think there's something useful, even if I haven't perhaps entirely coherently formed what I think about it in my head. But this idea of resistance, solidarity as an aberration from outside the system, and how that's kind of necessarily the character of an effective opposition to a totalizing system. So I will end that here. Again, as with the last Philip K. Dick one I did on the simulacra, I'm not sure this is one of Dick's best novels. But we'll be getting back onto some good ones soon, definitely. As I say, next one will be either Dr. Blood Money or The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, which is one of his most difficult and strange and interesting books. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please consider checking out the Patreon at patreon.com/Utopian Horizons, where you can support me to help keep doing this and get access to lots more bonus episodes. I will be doing another one probably this week or next week. So that'll be coming. You can get in touch with me at utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments or anything. And I'm on Twitter at Utopian Horizons. Please review the podcast if you could. That would help as well. I've been talking for way too long. It's time for me to go to bed. Thank you for listening, and I will be back soon with more episodes. Bye-bye.